It had only been 3 weeks since I moved with my daughter, little Emily, into the small lakeside neighborhood where I believed we would finally find peace, and at first, it seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of city life: quiet streets, tall pine trees, neighbors who waved politely from their porches. But as with all things that appear too good to be true, it wasn't long before the darkness revealed itself in the form of Patricia, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman, whose sharp eyes lingered on us from the moment the moving truck pulled into the driveway, her disapproving glare fixed on Emily's wheelchair ramp like it was an act of rebellion rather than a lifeline for my child. I still remember Emily's small voice, full of excitement, whispering, "Mommy, maybe here no one will laugh at me," and the way my heart swelled with hope, only for it to crumble when Patricia crossed the street on that first morning with a clipboard clutched against her chest, her lips thin and pressed tight, barking that all exterior modifications must be approved before she even introduced herself. Her gaze never leaving Emily, who sat quietly in the shade of the porch, her hands folded in her lap, watching this strange woman with wide, nervous eyes. I tried to explain gently that the ramp wasn't optional, that Emily needed it to get in and out of the house, but Patricia dismissed me with a flick of her hand, muttering something about lowering property values and special treatment, and I felt my stomach knot with the first wave of dread, the quiet understanding that this woman wasn't just going to be difficult, she was going to be cruel, and in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Over the following days, her presence became impossible to ignore. She parked her SUV at the edge of our driveway, as though to remind us she was watching. She complained about the sound of Emily's laughter. When I pushed her wheelchair down the sidewalk, she even made snide remarks. About the wind chimes, I hung outside, claiming they were a disturbance to the neighborhood aesthetic, but what disturbed me most wasn't the words she spoke, it was the way her eyes lingered on my daughter, hard and unblinking, as though Emily were some stain on her perfect little community, rather than a child who had already endured more suffering than most adults could bear. One evening, after I put Emily to bed, I caught Patricia standing on the sidewalk, staring at our house with a brick cradled loosely in her hand as if testing its weight, and when I stepped outside pretending to check the mailbox, she smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and whispered, "Accidents happen, before tossing the brick back into the pile beside her flower bed as though it had been nothing more than a garden tool. And I went back inside, shaking, clutching the doorknob as though it were the only thing tethering me to safety, praying that Emily would never see the darkness I had just glimpsed in Patricia's eyes. The days that followed that chilling night when Patricia stood outside with the brick became a slow descent into a nightmare I could neither escape nor fully understand, because what began as hostile stares and condescending remarks soon spiraled into something far darker, something calculated, as though Patricia had made it her personal mission to break us piece by piece, starting with Emily. The first sign came with the letters, official-looking envelopes slipped under our door or taped to. Our mailbox with the HOA's stamp across the top, each one demanding we remove the wheelchair ramp or face fines we could never afford. And though I tried to fight back by explaining in writing, by attaching doctor's notes, even photographs, proving its necessity, the replies came sharp and cold, always signed by Patricia, reminding me that exceptions could not be made for one family's convenience. And the more I read them, the more I felt the walls closing in. Emily, sweet and sensitive as she began to notice the tension. I caught her once, quietly tearing up one of the notices before I could see it, her little hands trembling as she whispered, "Mommy, if it makes her happy, we can take it down. I don't want her to be mad at you." And the guilt crushed me, knowing my child, already battling her body's limitations, was now burdened with the weight of a neighbor's cruelty. Things escalated further when Patricia began showing up unannounced, knocking on the door at odd hours, claiming she was there to inspect violations, barging past me with her nose in the air, scanning every corner of our home as though she had a right, and each time her eyes would inevitably land on Emily sitting small in her chair, shrinking under that venomous gaze, until one evening Patricia leaned down, lips curling into a thin smile, and hissed, "If you can't control her noise, I will," words that left Emily trembling and clinging to me, begging me not to leave her side, even for a moment. The neighbors, at first polite, began avoiding us, perhaps swayed by Patricia's whispers, perhaps too afraid to cross her, and soon we were alone, isolated, the cheerful community we'd hoped for transforming into a cage built by gossip and fear. The worst of it came late one night when I heard footsteps on the porch and opened the door just in time to see Patricia crouched beside Emily's wheelchair, her fingers brushing the wheels as though testing their strength, and when I demanded to know what she was doing, she straightened with that same smile and said, just making sure it's sturdy, wouldn't want her rolling somewhere she doesn't belong, before walking off into the shadows, leaving me shaking with rage and terror. I tried calling the HOA board, tried contacting the police, but Patricia was clever. Every move she made stopped just short of criminal, every threat wrapped in plausible deniability, and each time the authorities brushed it off as a neighborly dispute, I felt the ground slipping further away. Emily grew quieter, her once bright laughter replaced with anxious silence, and one evening as I tucked her into bed, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked, Mommy, why does she hate me? Did I do something wrong? And though I held her, kissed her forehead, and swore she had done nothing but be the most beautiful soul in the world, I couldn't shake the truth that Patricia's hatred wasn't about ramps or rules. It was about power, about cruelty, about something inside her that found satisfaction in tormenting the innocent. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon when I caught Patricia standing at the edge of our yard again, holding that same brick, her knuckles white. Around it, her gaze locked on Emily as she played with a stuffed animal in her lap, and though Patricia dropped it when I stepped outside, casually kicking it into the grass with a smirk, I knew deep in my gut, in the kind of instinct no mother can ignore, that she was waiting, planning, biding her time until the moment came when she would finally strike and no amount of locks, letters, or pleas could stop her. It happened on a Monday afternoon, the kind of day that should have been ordinary, harmless, filled with nothing more dramatic than the sound of birds in the trees and the hum of cars in the distance. But for us, it became the moment everything shattered. The day Patricia finally crossed the line from menace to monster. Emily had been sitting peacefully at the end of the driveway, clutching her favorite stuffed bear and watching the neighbors' children ride their bikes, her face lit with the kind of quiet joy that made my heart ache because it was so rare to see her carefree. And I was only a few steps away, kneeling by the flower bed, when I saw the flash of movement, Patricia emerging from behind her hedge, her eyes locked on Emily, her hand clutching that same jagged brick I had seen her toy with for weeks, and though my body screamed at me to move, to scream, to do anything, the world seemed to slow in those few terrible seconds as she marched forward, her lips twisted into a sneer, shouting something about teaching brats a lesson before she raised the brick high above her head and brought it down with a sickening crack against Emily's temple. The sound, it wasn't just the brick colliding with flesh and bone, it was the sound of my entire world splintering apart, the sound of innocence stolen, and I remember the way Emily's eyes went wide with shock before her small body slumped sideways in her chair, her bear tumbling to the ground, blood blooming scarlet against her pale skin, and the scream that ripped from my throat was so raw, so primal, that even Patricia flinched for a moment, though she quickly masked it with that same cold smile, tossing the brick aside as if she had merely swatted a fly, murmuring, "Maybe now she'll be quiet." Before turning as though she had accomplished something righteous, my legs carried me to Emily before I could think, my trembling hands pressing against her wound, my tears falling onto her cheeks as I begged her to stay with me, to breathe, to not leave me, and the neighbors who had once avoided us now stood frozen at the edges of their yards, their faces pale with horror, none of them moving to help their fear of Patricia or perhaps their fear of involvement. Keeping them rooted in place, I screamed for someone to call 911, my voice breaking, and finally a teenager down the block fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. And in those agonizing minutes while waiting for help, I felt Emily's small hand twitch in mine, her lips parting as though to whisper. But no words came, only a faint, broken breath that made me cling to her harder, praying to every power in the universe not to take her from me. The wail of sirens eventually split the silence, flashing lights bathing the street in red and blue as paramedics rushed to us, prying me gently away as they stabilized her, voices sharp and urgent as they spoke words like severe trauma, possible skull, fracture, keep pressure, and though my mind was spinning, I caught the faint trace of blood on Patricia's shoe as she stood to the side, feigning shock, her voice dripping with false innocence as she told the officer, The girl startled me. I was just gardening, and she rolled right into me. An accident, I swear, and I wanted to leap at her, to tear that lie from her throat, but my body was too weak, my spirit too broken. All I could do was watch as they loaded Emily into the ambulance, her face pale and still, an oxygen mask covering her delicate features, while Patricia's crocodile tears convinced half the crowd that perhaps it had indeed been an unfortunate mishap. I rode in the ambulance, clutching Emily's tiny hand, whispering to her that she wasn't alone, that Mommy was right here. But with every jolt of the vehicle, with every glance at the monitors, I feared I was whispering to a child slipping further and further from this world. At the hospital, they wheeled her away. Under harsh white lights, doctors swarming, nurses shouting codes and terms I barely understood, and I collapsed into a chair, my face buried in my hands, the taste of salt and blood in my mouth from where I had bitten my lip until it bled, my whole body trembling with grief and rage. Hours passed like lifetimes, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my lungs as I sat in that waiting room, jumping at every footstep until finally a doctor appeared, his expression grave, his words measured, saying Emily had sustained a significant head injury, that they had managed to stabilize her for now, but the swelling was severe, the damage extensive, and the next 24 hours would decide everything. My heart cracked open with both relief that she was alive and terror at how close she still stood to death, and as I clung to the faint hope the doctor offered, I swore to myself through clenched teeth that Patricia would not get away with this, that no matter how many lies she spun, no matter how powerful her hold over the neighborhood, she would answer for the brick she had brought down on my baby's head. But as I looked through the small hospital window and saw her standing outside in the parking lot, smiling up at the room as though daring me to fight back, I realized this battle was only beginning and the war for Emily's justice would demand more strength than I had ever known I possessed. When the call finally reached Daniel, my husband, the man I had not seen in nearly 2 years since he deployed overseas, it was through a chain of frantic messages and desperate voices that carried the news across oceans and deserts until it found him on some remote base where the sun scorched the earth and sand clung to everything, and though the voice on the other end of the line tried to deliver the words gently, there was no way to soften the blow. His little girl had been attacked, bludgeoned by a neighbor with a brick, and was now clinging to life in a sterile hospital room thousands of miles away. They told me later that Daniel went silent for a long moment, staring at the ground, his knuckles tightening around the radio until his comrades thought he might crush it, and then, without a word, he walked into his commanding officer's tent and demanded leave, his voice low and sharp, carrying a weight of fury that made even hardened men hesitate. And within days, he was on A, transport back home, each mile bringing him closer not just to his family, but to a storm he had no idea was waiting for him. I will never forget the moment he walked into that hospital room, his uniform still dusty from travel, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, and the sight of his daughter lying pale and fragile beneath a tangle of wires and machines shattered him in a way I had never seen before. This was a man who had stared down gunfire, who had carried wounded brothers off battlefields, who had known the cold hand of war, yet as he dropped to his knees beside Emily's bed and gently took her hand in his rough, callous fingers, his shoulders shook, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Daddy's here, baby girl, I'm so sorry, I should have been here, I should have kept you safe," and tears rolled down his face unchecked. For hours he refused to move, clutching her hand, pressing his forehead against it, murmuring promises and apologies, until finally he stood, his jaw tight, his gaze burning with a fire that scared me as much as it comforted me, because I knew the soldier in him had awakened, and whatever mercy he might once have shown had been buried the moment he saw our daughter's bandaged head. Later that night, as Emily finally drifted into a restless sleep, Daniel pulled me into the hallway, his voice low but edged with steel, demanding every detail of what had happened, and as I recounted Patricia's months of harassment, the letters, the threats, the way she had stood outside our house, smiling after the attack, I watched the muscles in his face twitch with barely contained rage, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, and when I finished, he stood silent for a long time before finally saying, "This ends now, she's not going to hurt our daughter ever again." And though I begged him to let the law handle it, to not risk losing himself in revenge, I knew my words barely touched him. He was already planning, already waging war in his mind. The next evening, while I stayed by Emily's side, Daniel walked back into the neighborhood, his uniform jacket gone, his broad shoulders tense beneath a plain shirt. And as he passed the whispering neighbors, they parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide as though they knew instinctively that the storm had arrived. And when he stopped in front of Patricia's house, standing tall and unflinching in the fading light, she stepped onto her porch with that same smug smile, arms crossed, and sneered. Well, look who finally decided to show up. Shame, you couldn't keep your cripple quiet before it came to this. And though Daniel's jaw clenched and his chest rose with a fury that might have consumed a weaker man, he didn't rise to her bait. He only stood there in silence, his eyes locked on hers with such intensity that I saw her smirk falter for the first time. That night, he returned to the hospital and sat by Emily's bed again, whispering to her, kissing her forehead. But when the monitors beeped softly and her chest rose and fell with fragile breaths, I saw his eyes drift toward the window, toward the street below where Patricia's porch light glowed, and I knew in that moment he was preparing for more than just a fight. He was preparing for justice, soldier's justice. The kind that doesn't wait for courts or boards to recognize right from wrong, the kind that comes swift and fierce when the innocent have been harmed, and as much as I feared what that might mean for him, for us, for Emily, I also felt something stir inside me, a dangerous, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare Patricia had built around us was finally about to collapse under the weight of the man who had come home not just as a husband and father, but as a soldier ready to defend his family at any cost. The very next morning, Daniel returned to the neighborhood. Not in uniform this time, but in a simple black shirt and jeans, his presence alone commanding the kind of respect and fear that no medal could ever grant. And while I stayed at the hospital with Emily watching over her fragile recovery, he walked into the heart of the enemy's den. The HOA office, a squat beige building at the edge of town where the board met weekly to decide the fates of families like ours. And as he entered, the chatter quieted, heads turned, and Patricia herself sat at the head of a table, her lips curling into that same venomous smile as she leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails against the wood like she already knew she owned the outcome. But Daniel was no ordinary man. He had faced interrogations, he had stared down lies in war zones where truth was a luxury, and he wasn't about to let a suburban tyrant play games with his family's life, so he planted his hands firmly on the table, his voice calm yet laced with steel as he laid out every violation Patricia had committed against us, every threatening letter, every unannounced intrusion, every cruel word directed at our disabled daughter, his words cutting through the air like blades. And though the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, Patricia smirked and said, "This is all hearsay. Your wife has always been dramatic, and now you're just trying to stir trouble. Accidents happen, soldier boy. And maybe if your girl wasn't always in the way, none of this would have happened." The room went silent, a collective intake of breath, because even her loyalists flinched at the venom in her words. But Daniel didn't lash out. He only pulled out a small flash drive, sliding it across the table, his eyes locked on hers. And when one of the board members hesitantly plugged it into a laptop, the room filled with Patricia's own voice, recordings from the security cameras Daniel had discovered, footage of her pacing near our driveway, muttering threats, standing over Emily's wheelchair in the dark, even the chilling words, "Accidents happen," that she had whispered to me weeks before. Gasps echoed around the room, whispers rose like a tide, and Patricia's smirk faltered for the first time, her face tightening as she tried to argue that the clips were taken out of context, that we were fabricating evidence. But Daniel's voice cut her off with a command so sharp it silenced the room. "Enough. My daughter lies in a hospital bed with her skull fractured because of you. You will pay for what you've done." He turned to the board, his eyes sweeping over each member, and said, "And every one of you who enabled her, who ignored our pleas, who looked the other way, you are complicit. You will not bury this under paperwork. Not while I'm here." The weight of his words left the room trembling, but Patricia, ever cunning, leaned forward, her smile returning in a twisted curve as she hissed, "You think a few shaky videos scare me? I own this neighborhood. The cops, the lawyers, they know who I am. And you're just another angry vet who can't let go of war." She stood, brushing past him with deliberate insolence, and whispered so only he could hear, "Your girl won't last long anyway. Kids like her never do. That was the moment Daniel's control cracked, his fist slamming into the table so hard the wood splintered, sending papers flying. And though he didn't touch her, the message was clear. His patience had run out. The board quickly called for adjournment, some muttering about legal liability, others already distancing themselves from Patricia. But she walked out with her head high, daring him to follow, and he did, his eyes tracking her every move, his soldier's instincts telling him this wasn't just a battle of words anymore. It was war. That evening, when Daniel returned to the hospital, his face shadowed with the weight of what he had uncovered, Emily stirred weakly, her small voice barely audible as she whispered, "Daddy, don't leave me again," and he knelt beside her, pressing a kiss to her hand, promising he never would. But even as he spoke the words, his mind was already sharpening its focus, mapping out strategies, piecing together the evidence, because Patricia wasn't just a cruel neighbor anymore. She was a predator, protected by a corrupt system, and if the system refused to bring her down, then Daniel would dismantle it himself, brick by brick, until justice was no longer a question, but a certainty written in the fear of those who thought they could hurt his daughter and walk away smiling. By the time the week had passed, Daniel was no longer just a grieving father. He was a soldier in enemy territory, studying Patricia's every move the way he once studied insurgents, patient and relentless. And though I begged him to let the police handle it, he knew, as I did, that Patricia's web of influence ran deeper than any badge or boardroom, that her lies would twist and slither until the truth was buried again. So he built his own plan, gathering evidence, speaking quietly to neighbors who had once feared her, but were now, emboldened by his presence, piecing together stories of her bullying, her threats, even past incidents covered up by her allies in the HOA, until he had a dossier thick enough to choke her arrogance. Yet Patricia, sensing the walls closing in, didn't retreat. Instead, she doubled down, strutting across our yard with her chin high, sneering at Daniel as though daring him to act, her words venomous. "You can scream and cry all you want, soldier, but no one here will touch me. Your crippled daughter was just the beginning. Families like yours don't belong here." Those words lit a fire in Daniel that no war had ever stoked, a rage so deep it shook me when I saw it in his eyes. And that night he prepared, not with weapons of steel, but with the armor of truth, the discipline of a man who had fought battles not just with guns, but with his very will to endure. He installed cameras, rallied the neighbors, and when Patricia made her next move, storming onto our porch under cover of darkness, brick in hand once more, she found Daniel waiting, his figure silhouetted in the glow of the porch light, his voice steady as he told her, "Not one more step." She laughed, a shrill, cutting sound, raising the brick as though to repeat her crime. But before she could even swing, Daniel's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with such force the brick tumbled to the ground, clattering against the wood like the sound of her empire beginning to collapse. Their faces were inches apart, her eyes wide with both fury and fear as he leaned close, his voice low, deadly calm. "You think you're untouchable because of your rules, your lies, your power games. But you forgot the one thing that keeps people like you in control: fear. And I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore. And neither is anyone else." Around them, shadows shifted as neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, phones recording, whispers spreading, until Patricia realized too late that her stage had turned into her trap, the soldier holding her in place while the weight of truth pressed down from every angle. She thrashed, spat curses, tried to scream about property rights and self-defense, but Daniel never struck her. He didn't need to because his restraint was the final weapon, the proof that he wasn't the monster she painted him to be. Instead, he forced her to face the flashing red and blue lights that pulled into the street moments later, the police this time armed not just with skepticism, but with undeniable evidence. Videos, testimonies, recordings, all compiled and delivered by Daniel himself. And for once Patricia's words fell flat, her shrieks of innocence drowned out by the chorus of voices from neighbors who had finally found their courage. As the officers wrestled her wrists into cuffs, she screamed threats, promises of revenge. But her eyes darted wildly, no longer the eyes of a queen, but of a cornered animal, and Daniel stood tall, watching with the cold calm of a man who had fought too long to allow a predator to win again. Yet even as Patricia was shoved into the back of the squad car, Daniel's heart pounded not with triumph, but with something darker, the adrenaline of war that never truly left him, and he clenched his fists, staring at the taillights until they disappeared, whispering under his breath a vow that if the system failed again, if she found a way back into our lives, he would finish it himself. When he returned to the hospital that night, he didn't tell Emily the details, didn't fill her fragile world with the darkness he had walked through. Instead, he knelt by her bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "She can't hurt you anymore, baby girl." Daddy made sure of it. But in his eyes, as I watched him stroke her hair, I saw the storm still raging, the soldier who had come home carrying both victory and the heavy weight of knowing the war for justice was never truly over. In the days that followed Patricia's arrest, the neighborhood that once cowered beneath her shadow transformed into something almost unrecognizable, as if the chains she had wrapped around every household had finally been shattered, and for the first time, people walked their dogs without glancing nervously toward her yard. Children rode their bikes in the cul-de-sac without fear being screamed at, and neighbors actually waved to one another, united not by silence but by shared survival. Yet, for us, the true battle was still inside the hospital room, where Emily fought to return to the little girl she had been before a brick fractured her world, and Daniel, who had faced fire overseas and monsters at home, now faced the hardest war of all, patience, as he sat by her bedside day after day, holding her hand, reading her stories, guiding her through the small, painful steps of recovery, his gruff soldier's voice softening into something tender each time he told her, "One more try? Baby girl, Daddy's right here." Slowly, through weeks of therapy and tears, Emily's laughter began to return, weak at first but growing stronger until one morning, as sunlight streamed across her blanket, she managed to sit up on her own and whisper, "Daddy, I'm not scared anymore." Those words broke him in ways no battlefield ever could, his tears falling freely as he wrapped her in his arms, knowing that no matter how scarred, her spirit had endured. And that meant Patricia hadn't won. Meanwhile, justice ground forward. The evidence Daniel had gathered, the testimonies from emboldened neighbors, the videos of her trespasses and threats, all of it painted Patricia not as a misunderstood homeowner, but as a predator who weaponized power against the vulnerable. And when the trial came, the courtroom was packed, not with strangers, but with the very people she had once controlled, each of them ready to speak, to testify, to finally cut out the poison she had planted in there. Community. I will never forget the sight of her standing there in handcuffs, stripped of her arrogance, the judge's gavel echoing as the verdict of guilty fell heavy across the room, her sentence sealing not just her fate, but the freedom of every family she had terrorized. And though she shouted as she was led away, promising revenge, threatening to burn this place to the ground, her words had no teeth left, because fear, the weapon she had used so well, had been taken from her. For Daniel, it was not the sound of justice that gave him peace, but the sound of Emily's footsteps weeks later when she finally walked back through our front door, fragile but smiling, her little hand clutching his. The home no longer haunted by Patricia's shadow, but filled instead with the promise of a future she almost stole. That night, as neighbors gathered on our porch with food, flowers, and promises of support, Daniel stood quietly at the edge of it all, his eyes scanning the horizon the way soldiers do, ever watchful, ever ready, until Emily tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, we're safe now, right?" He knelt, his weathered hands cupping her face, and with the weight of every war he had fought and survived, he smiled softly and said, "Yes, baby girl. Safe. Always." For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw his shoulders relax, the soldier laying down his armor not because the world was perfect, but because, in that moment, his family was whole again, and that was the only victory that mattered.